Welcome to Valid History. Here, old photos tell real stories from the past. Please subscribe, like, and share to help keep history alive.
At the port of Corufea in 1957, a father and son grieve as relatives board a boat bound for Buenos Aires. Their farewell, a quiet testament to the desperation that economic hardship forced upon countless Spanish families. A Chinese woman photographed in the late 1800s bears the lifelong consequence of foot binding, a practice imposed since childhood that permanently deformed millions of women across generations of Chinese society. Geert Adriaens Boomgaard, photographed on his 100th birthday in 1888, would live another decade to age 110, outliving all 12 of his children and standing as the first validated supercentenarian on scholarly record until 1966. At 7 feet 11 inches tall, Anna Swan was among the tallest women ever documented, and in 1871 she married Martin Van Buren Bates, who himself stood at 7 feet 9 inches, making theirs one of history's most remarkable unions. Dutch children, photographed around 1900 upon arriving at Ellis Island, were among the nearly 12 million immigrants processed at the port of New York and New Jersey between 1892 and 1954 under federal immigration law. A U.S. soldier in Vietnam in 1967 holds a jungle centipede that appears 2 feet long, though forced perspective created by a fishing string made the 10-inch insect seem far larger than it actually was. On the Harvard Bridge in Boston in 1908, escape artist Harry Houdini stood shackled in chains before a crowd of 20,000 spectators, plunged 30 feet into the Charles River, and resurfaced 40 seconds later holding the shackles in his hands. During China's Cultural Revolution in 1971, children swear allegiance to Mao Zedong's Little Red Book, a mass ideological campaign launched in 1966 to purge capitalist and traditional elements from Chinese society under Communist Party rule. At the Italian Cavalry School of Pinerolo in 1906, every graduating officer was required to complete the Descent of Montbrun, a 20-foot drop named after a ruined castle standing roughly 3 miles from the school near Turin. Princess Fatma Khanum, a member of the royal Persian family photographed in the mid to late 19th century, is captured here in a portrait that stands as one of the rare surviving images of Persian royal women from that era. A patient photographed in restraints at the West Riding Lunatic Asylum in Yorkshire, England in 1869 offers a stark and unsparing record of how mental illness was institutionally managed in Victorian Britain. The Swedish warship Vasa sank in 1628, less than a mile into its maiden voyage, and lay on the seabed for 333 years before being recovered almost completely intact and permanently housed at the Vasa Museum in Stockholm. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes, lion daughters of the Queen Mother's brother, were hidden from public knowledge for decades. Neither woman ever learned to speak, and they lived out their lives largely unknown, despite their direct connection to the British royal family. Workers forged the anchor chain for the RMS Titanic in 1909, their labor producing one of the most recognizable artifacts of a ship that would sink just 3 years later on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic. Taken in Paris in 1838 by Louis Daguerre with a roughly 10-minute exposure. This image captures a man pausing to have his shoes shined, and in doing so became the earliest known photograph to show a recognizable human being. Boxer Fred Bretignolles is photographed twice, at 15 in 1920 and at 23 in 1928. The span of a career of 76 fights framed by a life that ended by suicide in September of that same final year. In 1965, Sister Mary Kenneth Keller became the first person in the United States to earn a doctorate in computer science. Her dissertation focused on constructing algorithms for analytic differentiation of algebraic expressions, written in CDC Fortran 63. A man stands with his wife and 13 children in Louisiana in 1938. a single photograph framing the scale of domestic life endured by ordinary American families during the economic devastation of the Great Depression era. Soviet soldier Evgeny Stepanovich Kobytev is photographed after 4 consecutive years of war between 1941 and 1945, his face carrying in plain sight the full accumulated weight of what the Eastern Front demanded of those who survived it. In the 1930s, metal cages were mounted outside apartment windows to expose infants to fresh air and sunlight, a practice accepted at the time as beneficial to child health in urban environments where outdoor space was scarce. In 1919 Paris, pilot Charles Godefroy flew his small plane, nicknamed Buffet, through the Arc de Triomphe, a feat that captured the daring spirit of the post-war generation in a single audacious pass over the Champs Élysées. On the set of E.T. in 1982, Steven Spielberg stands beside the iconic alien creation that would make cinematic history, a quiet moment behind the scenes of one of Hollywood's most beloved films. A street view captured in New York City in August 1966 preserves an ordinary afternoon in one of the world's most dynamic cities, at the height of an era defined by sweeping social and cultural transformation. In 1954, an Italian family gathers around the television in their country house, a domestic scene that quietly marks the moment when broadcast technology began reshaping everyday life across post-war Europe. Photographed around 1900, a woman stands with her umbrella in hand, a composed portrait from the final years of the Victorian era, when formal street photography was still a rare and deliberate act. Jim Henson poses with members of the Muppet cast from Fraggle Rock around 1985, a candid image of the puppeteer surrounded by the vivid characters he brought to life for generations of audiences worldwide. In October 1927, a person demonstrates the holdophone, a device designed to free the hands during telephone calls, capturing an early moment in the long history of humanity's effort to make communication more convenient. A motorcycle chariot race tears across a track in New South Wales, Australia in 1936, a spectacle that merged mechanical horsepower with the ancient tradition of competitive chariot sport in a distinctly modern form. Yeoman warders stand at attention outside the gates of the Tower of London in 1898, their ceremonial uniforms unchanged for centuries, silent guardians of a fortress that had held prisoners, treasures, and secrets since the 11th century. College students photographed in the 1950s offer a composed snapshot of campus life during a decade when American higher education was rapidly expanding and shaping an entirely new post-war generation of young professionals. A woman calmly feeds a bear in Washington in 1927, a striking image from an era when boundaries between humans and wildlife in public spaces were far more permissive and considerably less regulated than today. Against a backdrop of painted canvas concealing Warsaw's destroyed buildings, a woman poses for her portrait in 1946, a haunting image where the effort to mask devastation speaks louder than the ruins it attempts to hide. An ice cream seller works the streets of Venice, Italy in 1933, his cart in quiet commerce a vivid fragment of daily life in a city that continued its rhythms, even as political tensions gathered across Europe. Captured in 1945, a 16-year-old German soldier weeps after being taken prisoner by the United States Ninth Army in Germany, his tears a stark and human testament to the collapse of a war machine built on conscripted youth. An undercover police officer walks his beat in Brooklyn, New York in July 1969, blending into the street life of a borough in flux during one of the most turbulent summers in American urban history. Customers drink from a portable milk bar rolling along the platforms of Waterloo Railway Station in June 1937, a peculiarly British solution to commuter refreshment in the years before vending machines changed station life entirely. Harrison Ford appears in character on the set of Blade Runner in 1982, his image anchoring one of science fiction cinema's most visually influential productions, a film that would define the cyberpunk aesthetic for decades to come. Handwriting analysts worked their booth at the Los Angeles County Fair around 1930, offering a glimpse into the popular fascination with graphology during an era when the science of the self was still a matter of public spectacle. Around 1920, a daredevil balances on the back legs of a chair placed atop stacked furniture on a ledge 20 stories above New York City, captured by photographer George Rinehart in an image that makes no apology for its vertiginous audacity. A fishing catch photographed at Big Lagoon in South San Francisco, California on the 11th of June 1908 documents a single day's haul from waters that still teemed with life in the early years of the 20th century. Albert Einstein stands at the Grand Canyon in 1931, the theoretical physicist pausing before one of the natural world's most monumental formations during a visit to the United States that would within 2 years become permanent. Baseball legend Satchel Paige is photographed looking immaculately dressed in Harlem in 1941, captured by George Strock in a portrait that frames one of the sport's greatest pitchers with the same dignity and style he carried on the mound. The entire British Concorde fleet is assembled in a single photograph at London Heathrow Airport on the 21st of January 1986, a rare image of the supersonic aircraft that compressed the Atlantic into a 3-hour crossing gathered together in one frame. A shoemaker works his craft in a photograph from the late 19th century, a quiet record of a skilled trade practiced the same way for generations, still essential in an era before mass-produced footwear transformed the industry entirely. A family of thylacines, commonly known as Tasmanian tigers, is photographed in captivity around 1930, just years before the last known individual of the species died in 1936, making this image an inadvertent document of imminent extinction. Photographer Harry Warnick enlists the NYPD in 1925 to reenact the moment officers halted city traffic for a cat named Blackie and her kitten, turning a small act of urban kindness into a carefully composed piece of press photography. Princeton sophomores crowd together for a photograph after a snowball fight in 1893, their disheveled composure and shared exhilaration frozen in a moment that feels entirely spontaneous, despite the formal conventions of late Victorian portrait photography. At the London premiere of E.T. in 1982, Drew Barrymore, Henry Thomas, Robert McNaughton, and director Steven Spielberg present Princess Diana with an E.T. doll, uniting Hollywood royalty and British royalty in a single unrepeatable moment. Louis Armstrong plays his trumpet for his wife beside the Sphinx at Giza in 1961, a private serenade set against one of the ancient world's most enduring monuments in an image where jazz and antiquity share the same frame. Max Factor demonstrates his makeup correction device in 1930, a mechanical apparatus designed to guide precise cosmetic application, standing beside his invention as a reminder that the beauty industry has always sought technological solutions to aesthetic problems. Photographed in the 1930s, a woman holds a sign reading "Just Divorced," her expression projecting the uncomplicated relief of someone who has made a decision and chosen to mark it publicly on an otherwise ordinary day. Sir David Attenborough cradles a bear cub named Benjamin in 1956, an early image of the naturalist who would spend the following 7 decades bringing the world's wildlife into the living rooms of audiences across the globe. Inside a Pennsylvania coffee shop in 1943, everyday life continues against the backdrop of a nation at war, the ordinary rituals of food and conversation persisting as millions of Americans served overseas on 2 separate fronts. George Lucas stands surrounded by props from the Star Wars universe, a photograph that places the creator physically among the objects and artifacts of the mythology he built from scratch into one of cinema's most enduring franchises. Architect Minoru Yamasaki poses in 1964 beside a model of the World Trade Center he designed, a photograph that captures the buildings in their most optimistic form, decades before their destruction transformed them into a global symbol of loss. 2 years Samshrak stands beside a massive felled tree in the Pacific Northwest in 1915, a routine workday image from an era of industrial-scale timber harvesting that was quietly and permanently reshaping the landscape of the American West. B-17 bombers fly in formation over Germany in 1943, escorted by P-47 fighters, a photograph taken from the air that documents the sheer mechanical scale of the Allied strategic bombing campaign during the Second World War. In 1959, children in the outskirts of Modena, Italy cross a river by pulley to reach school, a photograph that frames their daily determination as both a practical act and a testament to the lengths communities went to secure education. The 1899 $5 silver certificate, the only United States banknote to feature a Native American chief, stands as a rare artifact of a monetary era when American currency occasionally acknowledged, however ambiguously, the continent's indigenous peoples. British soldiers take an impromptu joyride on a Mark IV tank during the First World War, a moment of levity borrowed from the machinery of industrial-scale warfare, human humor asserting itself briefly against the weight of the Western Front. Elvis Presley poses beside a Messerschmitt bubble car in Memphis in 1956, the king of rock and roll photographed alongside one of the most eccentric automotive designs of the post-war period in the year his fame became unstoppable. Disneyland is photographed in 1961, just 6 years after the park opened its gates in Anaheim, California, already established as the physical embodiment of Walt Disney's ambition to build a world where imagination and commerce occupied the same address. Christian Bale is photographed as a teenager in the 1980s, an early image of the actor who would go on to transform his body and inhabit roles across 4 decades with an intensity that made him one of his generation's defining screen presences. Eddie Rickenbacker of the 94th Aero Squadron sits in the cockpit of his Newport 28, photographed during the First World War when the American ace was accumulating the combat victories that would make him the United States' top fighter pilot. Harrison Ford is photographed in 1981, presenting a considerably less weathered appearance than the characters he was already making famous, caught between the releases that would cement him as the defining action star of his Hollywood generation. The 5-megabyte IBM hard drive is photographed in 1956, a machine that required industrial-scale hardware to store what a modern thumbnail drive holds 1 million times over, a monument to how far data storage technology has traveled in 70 years. A child's face registers pure astonishment upon meeting Andrafe the Giant in the 1970s, the scale of the encounter made instantly legible in the boy's expression, a photograph that needs no caption to convey the enormity of the moment. The Mfayori Battalion performs the Haka in Egypt in 1941, a ceremonial assertion of cultural identity carried thousands of miles from New Zealand to the North African theater by men who brought their heritage with them into war. Clint Eastwood rides his motorcycle in the late 1960s, a photograph that captures the actor during the years when his screen persona and personal image were becoming almost indistinguishable, both built on the same quiet, unhurried self-possession. Led Zeppelin is photographed together in the 1970s, the 4 musicians captured during the decade when their combination of blues, rooted power, and studio ambition made them the definitive measure against which all subsequent rock bands would be compared. Goliath the elephant seal rests beside his keeper at Vincennes Zoo in Paris in 1936, the vast animal and the human figure beside him composing an image that quietly underscores the extraordinary gulf between species sharing the same enclosed space. A grocery store in Oakland, California is photographed in 1942 as its Japanese American owner is evicted under the wartime internment orders, a document of institutional injustice recorded with the plain economy of a press photograph taken in real time. Smoke rises over crumbling buildings following the San Francisco earthquake of April 1906, a street-level photograph made in the immediate aftermath of a disaster that killed thousands and reduced much of the city to rubble within 2 days. Navajo youth Tom Torlino is photographed upon entering the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1882, and again 3 years later, the two portraits placed together as a document of the forced assimilation policy the school was explicitly designed to achieve. British archaeologist Howard Carter opens the door to the second of 4 gold shrines surrounding the sarcophagus of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings in 1922, a moment in one of archaeology's most celebrated discoveries captured with measured precision. Gregory Peck is photographed reading his famous book, the actor's quiet concentration offering an image of the man behind the roles in a candid moment that strips away performance and leaves only the private act of reading. A portrait of Bob Ross is taken in 1983, capturing the painter and television host in the early years of his program, before his gentle instruction style and signature hair became among the most recognizable images in American public broadcasting. The Lincoln Memorial is photographed in 1917, the building still under construction and surrounded by a city that barely resembles the present-day image beside it, a before and after pairing that measures a century of change in 2 frames. An Iowa couple poses on their wedding day in 1899, their formal portrait made at the close of a century that had seen the American Midwest transformed from frontier territory into farmland, and marriage documented with quiet, unhurried dignity. A couple dances on ice skates at Whitestone Pond in Hampstead, London in 1933. Their synchronized movement across the frozen surface, a small act of grace photographed during a decade that balanced elegance and economic hardship in uneasy combination. A migrant farm worker sits with his wife and 10 children in 1936. The family portrait made the same year, Dorothea Long photographed her iconic migrant mother, both images drawn from the same landscape of Depression-era agricultural displacement. Auguste Rodin sits in his studio in 1905 beside the thinker, the sculptor photographed in proximity to his most recognized work in a composition that quietly mirrors the contemplative posture his bronze figure has held for over a century. A giant snowman stands before Muir Glacier in Alaska in 1902, its scale dwarfed by the ice field behind it, a playful human construction posed against a natural monument that has since retreated dramatically due to glacial melt. The cast of The Outsiders is photographed in 1983, the young ensemble assembled for Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation of C. Hinton's novel at a moment when several members of the group stood on the edge of major Hollywood careers. Dr. Seuss draws The Grinch in 1957. The author and illustrator photographed at work on one of his most enduring characters in the year the book was published, his pen tracing the outline of a figure that would outlast the century. A man clears snow from telephone lines during a Siberian winter in 1960, balanced above a frozen street in a photograph that frames the ordinary labor of maintaining infrastructure against the extraordinary severity of the coldest inhabited landscape on Earth. British soldiers play a game of soccer wearing gas masks somewhere in northern France in 1916, a photograph that captures the absurdist determination to preserve normalcy within a war whose industrial violence had made normalcy all but impossible. In 1987, a 7,600-ton apartment building is relocated in Alba Iulia, Romania, to make way for a new boulevard, an engineering undertaking of remarkable scale photographed as the structure moves intact through the streets of the city it once stood still in. Breaker boys employed by the Pennsylvania Coal Company are photographed in 1911, child laborers whose working conditions would help catalyze the labor reform movements that spent the following decades pushing American industry toward its first meaningful protections for young workers. Bruce Lee is photographed with his Wing Chun master Ip Man in the 1960s. The two figures framed together in an image that places the martial artist who would define the genre beside the teacher who shaped the foundation of his technique. The first known photograph of the White House is taken in 1846, a daguerreotype image that captures the executive residence 11 years after photography itself was invented, and decades before the building acquired its current form and surrounding landscape. John F. Kennedy Jr., 3 years old, salutes his father's flag-draped casket outside St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington on the 25th of November 1963, a gesture of unknowing solemnity that became one of the most remembered images of the 20th century. Designer Benjamin Bowden stands with the prototype of his Spacelander bicycle in London in 1946, presenting a futuristic design that would not reach commercial production for over a decade, the object already looking like a dispatch from a different tomorrow. A photograph from the 1870s shows a person posing with their cat, evidence that the human fascination with documenting feline companionship is not a product of the internet age, but a consistent thread running through the entire history of photography. English Boy Scouts collect funds for survivors of the Titanic disaster in 1912, photographed in the immediate aftermath of the sinking as communities across Britain turned the instinct to help into organized street-level action within days of the news breaking. Walt Disney kneels beside a cat in 1931 and appears to explain Mickey Mouse to it, a whimsical photograph made in the early years of the character, who would become the cornerstone of an entertainment empire built on the power of animation. A soldier poses with his wife and 2 daughters in a portrait from 1863, the image attributed to Cecil County, Maryland, where it was likely made by a member of one of the 7 United States Colored Troops regiments raised in the state. Venus, the bulldog mascot of the British destroyer HMS Vansittart, is photographed around 1941. A ship's dog whose presence aboard a Royal Navy vessel during wartime placed her squarely within a tradition of canine mascots that stretched back through centuries of naval service. The entire Microsoft staff is photographed together in 1978, a small group of young engineers assembled in a single image, taken years before the company's operating system, transformed personal computing, and made several of the faces in that photograph among the wealthiest people on Earth. A horse-drawn cart passes through a tunnel cut directly through the base of a giant sequoia at Yosemite Park around 1879. The living tree treated as a tourist attraction and a thoroughfare in the same gesture, decades before the park's conservation priorities shifted. New York City's subway is photographed in 1981. The cars covered in graffiti from floor to ceiling in an image that captures the transit system at the height of the fiscal crisis era, when the city's infrastructure wore its neglect openly on every surface. Ernest Hemingway keeps himself in shape by boxing while on a big game safari in Kenya in 1952. The author photographed at 62, still cultivating the physical self, image that was as much a part of his public identity as the prose. Galileo Galilei's drawings of the moon, made in 1610, document the earliest telescopic observations of the lunar surface, the sketches capturing mountains, craters, and shadows with a fidelity that challenged centuries of received wisdom about the perfection of celestial bodies. A United States mail mule, drawn stagecoach carries passengers through Texas in 1907, a mode of transport already being displaced by the automobile in the same decade, photographed just years before the rural mail routes it served were transformed entirely. Customers outside a Walworth pub raised their glasses in 1933 to celebrate cheaper beer, a day after Chancellor of the Exchequer Neville Chamberlain reduced the price of a pint by a penny in his budget, a modest measure met with unambiguous public approval. Two women wash clothes by hand in England around 1905, photographed by Frank Meadow Sutcliffe in an image that documents domestic labor with the same quiet ethnographic attention he brought to the working communities of the Yorkshire coast. A food truck operates on the streets of Washington, D.C. in 1919, an early example of mobile street food commerce in the American capital, photographed at a moment when the city was still absorbing the social and economic dislocations of the First World War. Wyatt Earp is photographed in 1923, the lawman of the Old West now in his mid-70s, his image documenting the remarkable fact that he had survived long enough to be photographed in the decade of jazz and cinema that followed the frontier era.